Newton's first law is the first mention that we have of forces. So now is a really good time to kind of understand what we mean when we say that a force is acting on an object. So at the end of this, you should be able to identify different types of forces and how they act on an object and understand the difference between a contact force and a field force. So these are some questions. What is a force? Describe some contact forces, describe some field forces. And we really want to kind of understand the direction of those forces, specifically gravity and normal. So force is really just a push or a pull between two objects. And there are two main categories of forces. You have forces that require that two objects be in actual physical contact, and these are called contact forces. Then you have forces where the two objects involved act on each other over a distance, and these are called field forces. There are a lot of different types of contact forces that we will discuss in this class. Probably the first one someone thinks of is friction. Friction occurs when the surfaces of two objects move against each other. The amount of friction will depend on the two types of surfaces. Say you run and slide across the tile floor in your socks. You will go quite a ways because the two surfaces involved do not apply a lot of friction to each other. Now, if you go do the same thing on a carpeted floor, what's going to happen? You're going to come to a stop much more quickly because the two surfaces have much more friction between them. The friction force will always act in the direction that is opposite the motion of the object that we're talking about. So let's say that you are the object that we were talking about. The tile or the carpet floor is what is applying the friction to you. You are trying to go in one direction, but friction is acting in the opposite direction of the way you are going. Now, objects do not need to be in motion for friction to occur. If you are pushing a heavy box, it might not move until you overcome the friction between it and the floor. So you are trying to push it in one direction, but friction is opposing that motion and keeping it where it is. Another contact force is tension. Tension force occurs when two objects pull against each other. Take the projector that's hanging from our classroom ceiling. Why doesn't it fall? There's a bracket up there that applies a force that keeps it up there. Tension also acts in the direction opposite of the motion, or opposite the direction that the object would be going if it were moving. Springs are pretty cool little devices that can either stretch or compress depending on how they are made. It's difficult to say for sure which direction a spring force will act without knowing more about the situation. So spring force is one that you really have to pay attention to the context and figure out what direction the object is moving and what direction the spring is actually pulling or pushing in. Air resistance is a complicated force that is really just a special type of friction. It will always act opposite the motion. The normal force is an interesting one. Anytime an object is sitting on a surface, the surface is applying a force. Take your computer sitting on your desk right now. Why is it not falling to the floor? The table is applying a force upwards, and this is called the normal force. Normal in math terms means perpendicular or at a right angle to. So if your table is a level surface, the normal force acts directly upwards. But if your table sits at an angle, it's not quite straight up. And we'll get into that a little bit more as well. An applied force is what we call a force that doesn't really fall into any specific category. So if you're pulling your wagon along the sidewalk, you are applying a force to it. If you're pushing a table across the floor, you are applying a force to it. Field forces do not require objects to be in contact with each other. Gravity is probably the most obvious example of this. Gravity is the force of attraction between two objects. When we get away from Earth, this becomes a little bit more complicated, but typically when we talk about gravity acting on an object right now, we are talking about the gravitational pull from the Earth. So unless it's otherwise specified, that's what we mean. So we will actually talk a little bit more about gravity later on in this unit. Static force is an interesting one as well. This is the force of attraction between two charges. Have you ever rubbed a balloon against your hair and stuck it to a wall? This works because you have changed the particles in the balloon and given it a charge. Magnetic force is the attraction between two magnetic poles. Bring a couple magnets close to each other and what happens? They either push each other away or they pull each other together. Now, static and magnetic forces are subjects that we will cover in a lot more detail in the next trimester. So, are you able to identify different types of forces and how they act on an object? And do you understand the difference between a contact force and a field force? Make sure your notes have these questions in them.